She thought she was just a librarian, until her eyes started glowing, and every wolf in the forest felt it. There are things the darkness keeps secret. Things that move between the trees when the rest of New England is asleep. Things that breathe and hunt and feel more deeply than any human heart ever could. Things that have existed in these ancient forests long before the nation that now claims them had a name. Lyra didn't believe in any of it. She believed in logic, in facts, in the kind of world that made sense in the gray morning light of Ashwick, where the cobblestones were cold and familiar beneath her boots and the library opened at 8:30 and everything had an explanation if you looked hard enough and long enough and with enough patience. The darkness, it turned out, did not care what Lyra believed. It had plans for her anyway. She woke up with her cheek pressed against cold earth and the smell of pine so thick she could taste it on the back of her tongue. The ground beneath her was hard and damp, and somewhere above her, through stone she couldn't see, the world was dark and very still. For 3 seconds, she thought she was dreaming. Then the chains around her wrists reminded her she was not. Lyra sat up slowly, every muscle protesting the movement, and took inventory of her situation the way her father had taught her to, quietly, carefully, without panic. Stone walls, dark and ancient, fitted together with a precision that spoke of age rather than haste. A single iron door, heavy and seamless, set into the far wall. A narrow window too high to reach that let in a blade of silver moonlight. And beneath that moonlight, dust motes turning slowly in the cold air like they had been turning for a very long time, and intended to keep doing so regardless of what happened below them. She was in a cell beneath someone's estate. She was alive. She had absolutely no idea why. The last thing she remembered was leaving the library. The walk home through Ashwick, past the chandler's shop and the apothecary and the milliner's that always smelled of lavender and sizing, and then the shortcut. The path at the edge of town that curved into the tree line and came out on the other side of the woods 3 minutes faster than going around. A path she had taken 100 times. A path that every person in Ashwick took, in daylight, without incident, and never after dark without a feeling they could not name pressing cold against the back of their neck. She had taken it after dark. She pulled at the chains experimentally. They held without so much as shifting. Iron, old and thick, fixed to a ring in the wall that had been there long enough to become part of it. Lyra exhaled slowly and looked around the cell again. There had to be something she was missing. There always was. What she found, after a thorough inspection of approximately 4 stone walls and 1 iron door, was absolutely nothing useful. No loose stones. No forgotten tools. No conveniently placed hairpin that she could use to pick the lock the way characters in the penny novels she secretly loved always managed with implausible ease. She was a librarian. She had read every escape story ever written. None of them had prepared her for this. She sat back down on the cold ground and pulled her knees to her chest and thought it through carefully, the way she thought through everything carefully, because panic had never once in her life solved a single problem, and she saw no reason to revise that position now. Someone had gone to the considerable effort of chaining her in an underground cell, which meant someone wanted something from her, which meant they needed her alive, which meant, for the moment, the most dangerous thing in this room was her own fear. And Lyra had made a quiet, firm decision somewhere around the age of 9, when her mother died and left her alone in a world that felt entirely too large and entirely too indifferent. That fear was a visitor she could acknowledge without inviting to stay. The door opened without warning. No knock, no announcement, just the sudden scrape of iron against stone and then torchlight flooding the cell and forcing her to squeeze her eyes shut against it. When she opened them, adjusting slowly, there were 2 of them standing in the doorway. Large, impossibly large, in the way that men in real life were not supposed to be. Broad through the shoulder and long in the limb, the kind of size that made the doorframe look as though it had been built for someone of more modest proportions and was quietly embarrassed about it. They wore dark clothing and no expression she could read, and they looked at her the way people look at objects, with assessment rather than acknowledgement. The one on the left said something to the one on the right in a language she didn't recognize. Old, it sounded, older than French, older than the Latin she had learned from the theological texts in the library's restricted collection. Something that felt, absurdly, like it had been spoken in these forests long before English arrived to replace it. The one on the right nodded. They both looked at her. "He will see you now," said the one on the left, in perfect, unaccented English. Lyra looked at him steadily. "I'm sorry," she said. "He will see me, as though I have an appointment." Neither of them answered. Which was, she decided, probably not a good sign. They walked her through corridors that had no business existing beneath a forest. Stone arches, ancient and precise. Torches set into iron brackets at intervals, burning without smoke in a way she filed away as something to think about later. Doors of dark wood reinforced with iron, each one closed, each one hiding something she couldn't hear through the stone. And somewhere in the distance, above her, she thought, on the floors of whatever estate stood over these tunnels, the sound of voices. Dozens of them, speaking in low and urgent tones that ceased every single time the moment she passed beneath them. As though the building itself was listening, as though it was reporting back. Lyra kept her chin level and her breathing even, and made careful note of every turn. Left, right, left, straight. 2 flights of stone stairs going up, the steps worn smooth in the center by what must have been centuries of feet. The torchlight changing quality as they climbed, less orange, more amber, warmer, until they emerged through a heavy door into a corridor that was, unmistakably, the interior of a grand house. Dark wood paneling, oil paintings in heavy frames, the subjects all severe-faced people in clothing that spanned 2 centuries. Candlelight rather than torchlight. The smell of beeswax and old paper and something else beneath it. Something wild and green and alive that had no business being inside a house, and yet was absolutely present, threaded through everything like a signature. The corridor opened into a hall. Large, genuinely, architecturally large, the kind of room that announced itself. High coffered ceiling lost in shadow. A fireplace at the far end big enough to stand in, burning despite the season. A long table of dark wood running the length of the room, its surface bare except for a single branch of candles at the center. And standing at the far end, his back to her, looking at the fire with his hands clasped behind him. Him. She knew immediately, with a certainty that had no rational basis, and that she resented accordingly, that it was him. The 2 men who had brought her straightened almost imperceptibly. A reflex, unconscious, the way people straighten in the presence of something that has the authority to matter. The entire room seemed to orient itself around him, the way compass needles orient toward north, not because they choose to, but because they have no other option. He didn't turn around. He made her wait. Lyra suspected, with a certainty that grew by the second, that he made everyone wait. When he turned, her first thought was entirely unhelpful, and she dismissed it immediately. Her second thought was more useful. He was dangerous. Not in the way of men who announced their danger with loud voices and large gestures. In the quieter, more permanent way of things that simply were what they were and made no apology for it. It lived in the set of his jaw and the steadiness of his dark eyes, and the complete and utter absence of anything in his expression that suggested he had ever once in his life been uncertain about anything. He looked at her the way she imagined he looked at everything, with the calm assessment of someone who had already decided what to do with it, and was simply confirming the decision. Lyra looked back at him the way she looked at difficult patrons at the library who believed that the restricted collection was a suggestion rather than a rule, calmly, directly, and with a patience that was mostly performance. "You're smaller than I expected," he said. His voice was low, the kind of low that didn't need volume to fill a room, the kind that came from somewhere deeper than the chest. "You're ruder than I expected," Lyra said, "and I expected very rude." Something shifted in his expression, not much, a fraction of something, there and gone before she could name it. She filed it away regardless. His name was Zane. She learned this not because he introduced himself. He did not, because apparently introducing oneself was beneath him, but because one of the men behind her whispered it to the other in the tone people use when they are reminding each other to be careful. Alpha of the Blackthorn Pack. She didn't know what that meant yet. She would. "Why am I here?" she said. Not a question. A demand, delivered in the same tone she used when a patron attempted to leave with an unreturned book and a convincing story about why the rules didn't apply to them. Zane studied her from across the length of the table, with the unhurried attention of someone who had nowhere else to be and every advantage in the room. "You were found in Blackthorn territory," he said. "I was walking home," she said. "Through land that belongs to this pack." "Through a public footpath," she said, "that I have used my entire life without consequence, until apparently last night, when someone decided that chains were a reasonable response to a woman walking home from work." A muscle in his jaw moved, small, almost invisible beneath the candlelight, but it moved. "You are either very brave," he said slowly, as though he were genuinely uncertain which, or very foolish. "I'm a librarian," Lyra said. "I'm neither. I'm simply tired, my wrists hurt, and I would very much like to go home." The silence that followed had weight to it, the particular weight of a room in which one person has all the power and has not yet decided what to do with that fact. Then, so unexpectedly that she almost missed it, the corner of his mouth moved. Not a smile. Something that had briefly considered becoming a smile and then thought better of it, as though smiling was a luxury he had given up somewhere along the way and wasn't entirely sure he remembered how. She filed that away too. She wasn't sure yet what it meant. But she had learned, in years of working with old texts and older silences, that the things people almost did were often more revealing than the things they did. He didn't let her go home. He told her, with the infuriating calm of someone discussing the weather over tea, that she would be remaining in Blackthorn territory until he was satisfied she posed no threat to his pack. He said it the way people say things that are not open to negotiation, not unkindly, not with cruelty, but with the absolute finality of someone who has never once in his life had to say something twice. Lyra stared at him. "I am a librarian," she said, again, slowly, in case he had missed the relevant implications the first time. "I organize books. I am approximately 5'4", and I have never in my life posed a threat to anything larger than a particularly stubborn card catalog." "You were found at the boundary line," he said. "Walking. At midnight. I work late. During a blood moon." Lyra opened her mouth, closed it. The blood moon. She had noticed it, of course. It had been impossible not to, that enormous red weight hanging over the tree line as she walked, casting the path in a light that turned everything familiar into something slightly strange. She had thought it was beautiful. She had not thought it was significant. "I didn't choose the moon's schedule," she said. Something moved behind his eyes then. Something she couldn't name and couldn't quite see clearly in the candlelight, but it was there, and it was not the expression of a man who was simply detaining a potential threat. It was something older than that, something that looked, impossibly, like unease. On a face that had clearly not entertained unease in a very long time. "No," he said quietly, "you didn't." And the way he said it made the air in the room feel different, heavier, as though a door had been opened somewhere that was not meant to be opened, and the thing on the other side had been waiting patiently for exactly this moment. Lyra didn't know what it meant. But Zane did. And for the first time since she had entered his hall, chin up, wrists bruised, looking at him as though he were an inconvenience she fully intended to resolve. The most powerful alpha in the northeastern territories looked at this small, tired, entirely unimpressed librarian and felt something move in his chest that he had spent the better part of 3 years trying to convince himself he had only imagined. They gave her a room. Not the cell. A proper room on the second floor of Blackthorn Manor, with a bed that was old but well-made. A fireplace that had been lit before she arrived. A window that looked out over the grounds and the tree line beyond, and a lock on the door that was, she noted with quiet satisfaction, on her side. She stood at the window for a long time that first night and looked out at the forest. Blackthorn territory spread in every direction as far as she could see, ancient trees. their bare branches reaching upward against a sky so dense with stars it seemed almost theatrical. And above everything, the blood moon. Still red, still heavy, still hanging in the sky with the particular quality of light that had made the walk through the woods feel strange, and had made, now that she thought about it, the path beneath her feet feel less like a familiar shortcut and more like an arrival. She thought about the way Zane had looked at her when she said she hadn't chosen the moon's schedule. The thing that had moved behind his eyes, the shift in the air of the room that she still couldn't explain. She thought about the pull she had felt, faint then, barely worth nodding, somewhere beneath her sternum. A warmth, a directionality. The way a compass needle doesn't move toward north because it decides to, but because it has no alternative. Adrenaline, she told herself. The body's response to an extraordinary situation, nothing more. Outside, somewhere deep in the forest, a wolf howled. Long and low and searching, like something calling out to something it had not yet found, but had never stopped looking for. Lyra's chest ached with a feeling she had no name for. Adrenaline, she told herself again. She was becoming a very unconvincing liar. She learned about the Ironclaw Pack on her second day. Not from Zane, he had not come to see her again, which she told herself was a relief and which felt, with the particular inconvenience of true things, like the opposite. She learned it from Maya, who had been assigned to bring her meals and who had clearly interpreted this assignment as including, at minimum, sitting down without invitation and saying whatever came to mind. Maya was small and quick-eyed and warm in the way of people who have decided that warmth is a choice they are going to keep making regardless of what the world does in return. She sat down across from Lyra on the second morning with the energy of someone who had been explicitly told not to talk to the prisoner and had found this instruction interesting rather than binding. "You know they're going to come for you," she said, without preamble. Lyra looked up from her breakfast. "Who?" "Ironclaw." Maya said it the way people say names that frighten them, quietly, with a careful stillness, as though volume might conjure the thing named. "They're the ones who brought you to the boundary, left you there for us to find." Lyra set down her fork and gave Maya her full attention. "Why," she said, "would anyone do that?" Maya looked at her with an expression that occupied the particular territory between pity and fascination. The expression of someone who knows something the other person does not, and is uncertain whether delivering the information is a kindness or a cruelty. "Because of what you are," she said. "I'm a librarian," Lyra said. Maya's mouth curved into a smile, gentle, careful. The kind of smile that is not really about humor at all, but about the delicate work of preparing someone for something large. "Lyra," she said softly, "you have no idea, do you?" Lyra held her gaze. No idea about what? Maya opened her mouth. The door opened. Zane filled the frame, not dramatically, not with announcement, simply with the particular quality of presence that meant every other thing in the room immediately became less significant. His dark eyes moved from Maya to Lyra and back to Maya with an expression that was unreadable in its entirety except for the jaw. And the jaw communicated with perfect clarity that he had heard every word of the conversation he had just interrupted. Maya was on her feet before Lyra had fully registered the movement. Zane looked at Lyra for a long moment. Something moved behind his eyes, something careful and deliberate, the way things move when they are being controlled rather than felt. "Come with me," he said. And despite every reasonable, sensible, librarian-brained argument that existed against following an arrogant, controlling stranger through an estate she didn't know and a territory she didn't understand, Lyra stood up and followed him. He took her to the edge of the forest. Not into it, to the boundary, where the manicured grounds of Blackthorn Manor gave way to the wild, where the grass grew differently, and the light changed, and the air carried something older and less tameable than anything the house contained. He stood with his hands clasped behind his back and looked out at the tree line and said nothing for long enough that the silence became its own kind of conversation. Lyra waited. She was good at waiting. Libraries had taught her that. The best things, the truest things, revealed themselves to the patient. Rushing them only made them retreat. "You were not supposed to be brought here," he said, finally. His voice was different out here, still low, still carrying that particular quality that seemed to occupy the air rather than simply move through it, but less controlled. As though the open space allowed something through that the walls of the manor kept contained. "I gathered that," she said. "Ironclaw left you at our boundary deliberately." A pause. His jaw tightened fractionally. "As a provocation, or something more calculated than a provocation." "A trap," she said, "using a librarian as bait." She heard how it sounded. "That is either very sophisticated or very desperate." "Using you," he said. And the weight he put on those two words, the particular, careful, deliberate weight, as though you was a word that meant something specific and significant, and he was choosing to use it regardless of the cost, made Lyra go still in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. "They knew what bringing you here would do," he said. "What would it do?" she said. He turned to look at her then, fully. In the gray morning light of the forest edge, without the amber softening of candlelight, his face was starker, sharper at the edges, more tired around the eyes than she had noticed before, and in his expression something she hadn't seen there yet. Something that sat uneasily on features that had clearly been arranged for a very long time to show nothing at all. He held her gaze for a long moment. Then he looked back at the tree line. "I don't know yet," he said. It was the first lie he told her. It settled in the air between them with the particular quality of things that are said when the truth is too large and too consequential and too irreversible to say out loud. And Lyra, who had spent years learning to read the silences between words, heard it for exactly what it was. She didn't call him on it. She filed it away instead, in the careful, quiet, librarian part of her mind that collected things she didn't yet know what to do with. She filed the lie next to the thing that moved behind his eyes, next to the shift in the air of the great hall when she had said she hadn't chosen the moon's schedule, next to the pull beneath her sternum that had not diminished since she arrived but had, if anything, grown quieter and more settled, as though it had decided she had noticed it enough and no longer needed to insist. They stood in silence for another long moment. She was aware of him with a precision that was entirely disproportionate to their acquaintance. The exact distance between them, the sound of his breathing, steady and controlled, the warmth he put into the air around him that had no rational explanation given the temperature of the morning. Then he said, without looking at her, "You should go back inside. It isn't safe at the boundary." "Is it safe anywhere in Blackthorn territory?" she asked. A pause, the ghost of that not-quite smile again, there and gone. "Safer than most," he said. She went back inside. He did not follow immediately. And standing at the second-floor window of her room, looking down at the figure still standing at the forest edge, hands clasped behind his back, looking not at the tree line now, but up at the window she was standing behind, as though he had known exactly where she was without looking. Lyra felt the pull in her chest, with a clarity that took her breath away. That night she stood at her window and watched the blood moon and thought about everything she didn't know. She didn't know what she was, whatever Maya had been about to tell her before Zane appeared. She didn't know what Ironclaw wanted with her, or why her presence in Blackthorn territory was calculated rather than accidental, or what Zane knew that he had chosen, deliberately and at some private cost, not to say. She didn't know why her chest felt like a compass needle that had found its north and was no longer interested in pointing anywhere else. She didn't know any of it. What she knew was this: she was a librarian. She believed in logic, in facts, in the kind of world that made sense in daylight. And standing at the window of a room in a house full of things she didn't have names for yet, under a blood moon that felt less like a celestial event and more like a witness. The daylight version of her life felt very, very far away. Outside, the wolf howled again. And deep in her chest, in a place she had not known existed before the night she walked into the woods, something answered. Not with sound, not with words, not with anything she could have explained to anyone in the language of the world she thought she lived in. Just recognition. The quiet, devastating kind. The kind that doesn't arrive like thunder, but like the moment your eyes adjust to a dark room and you realize, with a calm that is almost worse than shock, that you can see everything. Lyra pressed her palm flat against the cold glass of the window. Her reflection stared back at her. Same face, same dark hair, same ordinary, unremarkable 5'4" librarian from Ashwick who organized books and believed in logic and had never once in her life been the kind of person anything extraordinary happened to. Except her eyes were glowing. Faint, gold, warm as candlelight in a dark room, glowing with a light that had no source and no explanation, and that illuminated nothing except the fact that somewhere between the life she had lived and the moment she was standing in right now, something had changed. Or perhaps, and this was the thought that settled over her with the quiet weight of something true, nothing had changed at all. Perhaps this was what she had always been, and the world had simply kept it from her until now. Lyra looked at her reflection for a very long time. Then, in the silence of the room, with the blood moon bleeding red across the floorboards, and the last of the howling fading back into the ancient dark of Blackthorn Forest, she said, very softly, to no one at all, "Oh, just that. Because some truths, when they finally arrive, don't announce themselves with thunder or ceremony or the dramatic flourish that stories have taught us to expect. Sometimes they come quietly, like moonlight through old glass, like the sound of something in your chest, something patient and ancient and entirely your own. Finally, after a lifetime of waiting. Answering. Lyra didn't know it yet, but every wolf in Blackthorn territory did. Every single one of them had felt it the moment she crossed the boundary, a shift in the air, a change in the quality of the night, the way the forest went still, and then, slowly, did not. Cadden had felt it and said nothing. Holt had felt it and sharpened his suspicion into something he could hold on to. Maya had felt it and smiled the way she smiled at things that were inevitable and beautiful and slightly terrifying all at once. And Zane, controlled, precise, arrogant Zane, who had led this pack for a decade without once letting anything move him that he had not first decided to allow, had felt it from the very first second he turned around in the great hall and saw her. He had known. He had known for 3 years. In fragments and visions and blood moon dreams he woke from in the cold dark of his room, reaching for something that wasn't there yet. He had known her face before he saw it, known the particular quality of her stillness, known, with the bone-deep certainty of things that are written before we exist, that she was coming, and that when she arrived, every careful, controlled, deliberate thing he had built around himself would have to reckon with her. He had known, and he had said nothing. The question that will outlast this night, and the next and every blood moon that follows, is why. Drop a wolf in the comments if Lyra's reflection gave you chills. And tell me, do you think Zane is staying silent to protect her? Or is he protecting something else entirely? Part 2 is coming. And in Blackthorn territory, the truth always finds its way out. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and comment.